The animation dropdown is going to allow you to control the period of time that the dynamic simulation is going to take place. There's also a relax option here that will allow you to kind of manually run through the simulation to slightly relax the hair. To start, we have auto time, and auto time is just going to set the hair simulation time to whatever your document is set to. So in this case, I have 50 frames. If I click play, the simulation runs for 50 frames. If I uncheck auto time, I can now specify the animation range. So if I wanted the dynamics to start at frame 10 and end at frame 40, I can set that there, and then as I play, you'll see we had 10 frames of a hold, 30 frames of animation, and then another 10 frames of a hold. Now you can set negative values in the start range as well, and this is good if you need a little bit of pre-roll on your simulation. Let's pause the animation and go back to the start. Now, hitting play on this scene here is fine because it's not a very complex simulation. But in some cases, the simulation may be very complex and it might take a lot of time to go from frame to frame. And in that case, using the play button is not necessarily the best option for previewing the dynamic simulation, just because it might take a long time between each frame. And to actually cancel that is fairly difficult, as you have to wait for enough CPU time to be freed up to actually be able to press that play button or pause button. So if we click on relax, it's going to run through 10 frames of the simulation and then stop. So it's not really something that we need to worry about interacting with once we hit the relax button. And like I said, sometimes the simulation may be quite intensive, and you could cut down the number of frames that you're previewing, so you could only do 5. And if we click relax, you'll see it goes through 5 iterations there. And we can do that as many times as we want. If we click on play, it is going to play from that position, but as soon as it goes back to the beginning, you'll see that it resets to the original position. So it's not baking this as your hair's initial position. It's just letting you get a preview of the dynamics. The Maps dropdown is going to allow you to work with the hair vertex tags to control the amount of influence that any given parameter has along the length of one of your guides. So you'll see that you have options to control the drag, stiffness, rest, hold, mass, and forces as well. And these will be things like particle forces, which could in turn be something like wind or gravity or any of those really. So if I go to the hair vertex tag here and select that, you'll see that one of these hairs has some different colored vertices. So where you see red on the hair, you're giving the guide a 100% weight, and you can set a variable weight along the entire length of the guide. The blue points are going to have 0 weighting applied to them. If we go to the hair object again, and choose something like the drag, and let's set that to 100%, and then click on play, you'll see that all of the hairs are currently being affected the same by the drag parameter. If we go to the maps and drag the hair vertex tag into the drag link field here, you'll see that on that hair, the points that are not weighted are falling faster, and then the points that do have weighting applied to them are being affected by the drag parameter up to the final value that we have in the drag parameter here. Okay, let's set this back down to about 10%, and we'll switch the hair vertex map onto the stiffness setting. So in this case here, you'll see the hairs that have no map applied kind of lay really limp along the surface. But where I have weighting applied, the stiffness is kept to its maximum of 100%, as long as my weighting is set to 100%. Okay, let's drag this into rest hold, and we will clear the other one. So with rest hold, again, we have to make sure that the parameter is setting the maximum value. So setting this to 100%, you'll see that all of those weighted points get 100% of the rest hold. And we can kind of blend between that however much we want until we get the desired effect. Next comes the mass link field. So we'll go ahead and copy the vertex map into there, and we'll clear it from the rest hold. We'll set the rest hold to 0%. Now here you see something really interesting happening. If we take a look at the setting, we have a mass of 1. So what it's saying is any point that has a weight attached to it is going to get a mass somewhere between 0 and 1. And as soon as the hair has mass, that means it is going to be affected by dynamics. Now all of these points that aren't weighted at all are getting a massive 0. And a massive 0 means that the points themselves are not going to be affected by dynamics at all. Next we have the forces link field. So again, we'll go ahead and drag the hair vertex map into the forces field, and we'll clear it from the mass. Once we do that, you'll see that the hair falls. If we go to the mass, we can adjust that, and it's not going to have any change. If we clear it, you'll see that all the hairs fall again. So let's just undo. So what's happening here is we're saying that only the selected points, or the weighted points, can be affected by the forces. And in this case, our biggest force is gravity. But this could really come to include any of the force objects that can be found in your simple particles here. The modifiers dropdown is a collection of spline graphs that's going to allow you to control the weighting of these parameters along the guide itself. This is different from the maps where you had to paint in the weighting for the guide. The modifiers is just going to give you a weighting from root to tip. If we hit play, you'll see that all the hairs fall. We'll go to the properties and set the drag to 100% again. If I go back to the modifiers, I can then take the spline graph knots here and adjust the weighting of that effect along the guide. So you'll see that the drag is stronger at the root and less intense at the tip. And if I invert my spline graph, I can see that the weighting is less at the root and more at the tip. And of course, if you really wanted to, you can affect just the middle of your hairs as well. The biggest difference with modifiers is that they're going to affect all of your hairs on the object, not just a selection of hairs. So we can go to the drag and let's reset that to default. We'll set the drag back to 0%. We'll set the drag back to 10%. Next, we will affect the stiffness. So we want the stiffness to be very stiff at the root and not stiff at the tip. So you'll see we get a nice curve there. If we reverse this, you'll see that we get the opposite effect. Let's set that back to 100%, and we can go to the rest hold. Let's set the rest hold to 100%, and then we can adjust the weighting of that across the guide. So you can see that we can get just the tip, and if we drag in another knot here for the spline graph, we can really get some good control over the rest hold value on these hairs. Okay, let's reset that again. And check out the mass. So again, we have the mass set to 2.5. And let's set the rest hold to 0% there. So we want to change the mass along the spline. And to do that, we can just adjust the spline graph. So now the tip is getting 0% mass, so the points just kind of hang in space. And the hairs get to almost sit like rope in between those 2 points. If we reverse this effect, you'll see that the points will fall again. And if we add some variation into this, we can get some really interesting effects with our hair. Okay, so let's reset this to default again. And take a look at forces. So if you remember, the forces were things like gravity or wind that we might add into the scene, and we can adjust the amount that these are allowed to influence the guide. Okay, again, we'll reset this to default, and we can go on to the next dropdown. The advanced dropdown is going to give you access to some of the more advanced features of the hair dynamics. Specifically, the way that the dynamics are going to be calculated. For this one, let's go to the Editor tab and set the display to hair lines so that we can see all of our hairs. We can go back to the Dynamics tab, and in here we have a drop-down for guides, or hairs. And this is going to determine what element of the hair object is going to be used for the dynamics calculation. For guides, you'll see that I'm getting fairly quick response, and my hairs are simply being interpolated between the guides. If I set the dynamics drop-down to hairs, you'll see that the simulation is much slower. But the results that I get are much better. The hair is still being interpolated between the guides, but at this point we actually have hair-on-hair collision. And this allows the hair to kind of sit on itself when it's dropping over. Whereas when we were just using the guides, the hair was able to get all the way down to the surface, because that's where the guide ended up resting. Next, there's a custom checkbox, and if you check this, the segments option here is going to become available. What segments is going to allow you to do is use an arbitrary number of segments, or a custom number of segments, on the guide or the hairs, depending on what you have selected for your dynamics here. When custom is unchecked, all it's going to use is the segment count that you have set in your guides or your hairs tab. So in the case of using the guides with 60 segments for our dynamic calculation, this might be a little bit overkill. So in this case we could enable custom and set the segments to something lower than whatever the segment count is in our guides tab. And that way the dynamic calculation is only going to be calculated with 8 segments rather than all 60. The one thing that can happen here is if I set this to something like 120, it's really overkill. Although the guides are going to have a really nice simulation, because there aren't really enough segments in the guide itself here, and if I set this to something lower, it's even more evident. The look of your results is not going to be that nice, just because there is such a disconnect between the two values. So let's go back to the Dynamics tab here, and uncheck custom, so it's just going to use whatever value we had set in the guides. And the final thing we have is steps and iterations. Steps is going to determine the number of subframes that Cinema 4D will calculate to determine the dynamic interactions of the hair. Now if you take a look at this hair right here, you'll see that it intersects the geometry. And this is because at some point there is a collision that it's missing, and this may be because there are not enough subframes for Cinema to actually capture that collision. So by increasing the number of steps, we can actually tell Cinema to do more divisions across there until it gets to the point where we're not getting any sort of intersection there. The one downside to increasing the number of steps is it is going to slow down the simulation. Iterations is almost like a multiplier for the springs that are kind of distributed along this guide. So the fewer iterations that you have, the less stiffness you'll get out of your guide. If we set this to 0, you'll see that the guides kind of flop around a lot more, and it also speeds up the simulation a bit. If I set this to something like 60, you'll see that the guides definitely have a bit more stiffness to them, but the simulation also runs a little bit slower. Generally, it's a pretty good idea to keep the number of iterations similar to the number of segments that you have in whichever tab you're kind of sourcing your dynamics out of. So in this case, with the iterations of 60, that's probably overkill, and I could choose something like 10. And you'll see that the difference isn't that great, but the response that I get in the viewport is definitely a lot better. A lot of the times, too, you can set this extremely high, like 300. And you'll see at this point, I may as well be using my properties or something like that, because the feedback is really slow, and at this point it's just not worth the speed hit to get these results using the iterations.